Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Aaron S. Lecklider discussing his book, Love's Next Meeting, The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture, in conversation with Avram Finkelstein. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved reading community that we are able to make events like this happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all of your questions. We will get through as many as our time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of Love's Next Meeting. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to the series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked Live Transcript on your display and click through all the options. And lastly, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this last year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Aaron Lecklider is a cultural historian and associate professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. His research, as tonight's book will attest, primarily focuses on the history of sexuality, class, race, and gender in 20th century American literature and society. He is the author of the previous book, Inventing the Egghead, The Battle Over Brainpower and American Culture, and writes frequently about social movements, politics, and art for venues such as Slate, Salon, Huffington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Tonight, he is joined in conversation by Avram Finkelstein, an artist, activist, writer, and a founding member of the Silence Equals Death and Grand Fury collectives. His book, After Silence, A History of AIDS Through Its Images, was nominated for an International Center of Photography's 2018 Infinity Award in Critical Writing and Research, as well as a Lambda Literary Award in LGBT nonfiction. His work has received support from numerous public commissions and is on permanent display in many distinguished collections, including the Whitney, the Metropolitan Museum, the Smithsonian, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and elsewhere. This evening, they will be discussing Aaron's latest book, Love's Next Meeting, The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture, a critical and inventive exploration of the relationship between homosexuality and the left in early 20th century America that Mary Helen Washington calls a richly researched but racy revision of left history that reveals that sexual dissidence and radical left politics were compatible. Uncovering a diverse cast of individuals and the explosive work they produced decades before Stonewall brought the queer art of survival to the forefront, Love's Next Meeting is a necessary corrective to our narrowed understanding of the left and those who formed its earliest ranks. Here, Aaron Lecklider excavates the archive, offering us glimpses into a past where the sexually marginalized participated in radical labor organizing, stood up to police brutality, and aligned themselves with the dispossessed across communities. We are so very excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Aaron and Avram.
Well, thank you so much to Benjamin for that lovely introduction. And I really want to thank everybody who is joining us virtually tonight for this event. I really want to give a tremendous note of gratitude to the Harvard Bookstore, who has continued to be an incredible space that is selling locally and independently a lot of the books that many of us read and love, And I'm broadcasting to you today from a 330 square foot apartment that, if the Harvard bookstore didn't exist, would probably be a 500 square foot apartment, because certainly I have spent much of my own time and money buying books from one of the best bookstores anywhere in the world. So it means a lot to me to be launching this book at a bookstore that's very close to my heart. I also want to really express my gratitude for Avram Finkelstein for agreeing to be in conversation with me today. Not only because I've learned so much from Avram over the years, but also because, as a queer person of a certain age, the fact that I can even be here now is in no small measure due to the activists and the brilliance of folks such as Avram, who, through work with ACT UP, through work with Gran, through work with the Silence Equals Death Collective, really showed how creative expression could be a central piece of what activism looks like, and an important part of how many of us have been able to survive under periods of intense repression. So it really means a lot to me to be able to have the first conversation about this book in a public space with Avram. And I'm looking forward to his questions, which I haven't seen in advance, and I know will be reflective of his brilliance as well. So just briefly, I wanted to just say a little bit about where this book comes from. So Love's Next Meeting is a book that tries to understand what the relationship is between radical politics, creative expression, and queer sexuality in a period when those three dimensions of American culture were not imagined to have been in conversation. So oftentimes I think we think about the more radical version of sexual politics as appearing in the 1960s or thereafter, and everything before that as being political movements that didn't really place sexuality at the center. So when I embarked on writing this book, what I really wanted to think about was if leftist social movements were oftentimes defined by some sort of sense of excitement about building a better world, how did sex factor into that? And what I found when I started digging into novels, letters, diaries, magazines, newspapers, was that sex was actually everywhere. The left was a place where sex was constantly being navigated and negotiated, and where people who were sexual dissidents actually had a voice to be able to articulate some kind of sexual politics, regardless of whether that was taken up by the people at the top of leftist organizations. It was happening on the ground. It was happening as part of a robust conversation. It was happening through creative expression. And so I wanted to try and reflect on that, to understand why that was happening, but also to try and understand why that story hasn't been central to the way we think about the left in the 20th century United States. So I might read a little bit from this book later on, but I think the best way to get a sense of the kind of work that I've been trying to do is really to have some kind of conversation about it. So I'm gonna let that conversation be steered by you, Avram, and at some point I might read just a little bit to get the voices of some of the people that I write about, to let them into the room. But for now, I'm going to follow your lead.
Cool. Full disclosure to everyone listening, I love Aaron Lecklider. And one of the, I'm very grateful for your flattering words, but I only know the parts of the left that I've lived. Aaron knows everything. So Aaron, I learned so much from reading Love's Next Meeting, and I've been dying to talk to you about it. And since American Studies obviously has no shelf life, I hope we can explore not only the past, but the present and the future as well. And I'd like to maybe start more broadly and then zero in, if that's okay with you.
Fine with me.
Cool. So let me start with the obvious question. What made you decide that it was high time the queer historical narrative needed to include the set of questions that Love's Next Meeting poses?
I think that one of the things that made me start thinking about this was that it was sort of well known that early gay rights organizing came out of the left. So in other words, the founders of some of the earliest gay rights organizations in the United States were sort of well known to have been members of the Communist Party. But the relationship between that history and the gay rights movement, I don't feel like it's been fully unpacked. So I wanted to know, what were they doing before they joined with the gay rights movement? What was it about their organizing that brought them into that? And then also I wanted to know why they were part of a movement that ended up expelling them. So in other words, was there something about the shape that that movement took that made it inevitable that they would eventually find themselves on the outs with that? So that was one piece. The other piece was that I was just shocked when I started reading, actually in the research for my first book, I was shocked to find that so many proletarian novels, left-wing novels, so many newspapers that other historians had written about, so many of the publications, so much of the art and culture had so much queerness in it. And I mean that not in terms of a reading practice. I was not reading queerness into these texts. I mean that there were actually queer people represented, that there was same-sex intimacy, there were all kinds of ways that art and literature and culture were reflecting a much more dynamic sexual politics than was supposed to have been there. So I wanted to know, how deep did that go? And it went very deep. Who were these people and why were they thinking about these things and writing about these things and producing art around these things? And why is that not central to the way we understand the history of the left? And why is that not central to the way we understand the history of sexuality? So all of those things sort of came together. I didn't know if I was going to be able to write this book. There was no like central archive. It's not like I could turn to one archive and find the entire history and just sort of present it. I didn't know if I would be able to find that much. But over the years, I found there was more than enough for a book. And Lord knows I had to cut down what I had to make this a book that could be sold at a reasonable price. So, I was sort of surprised by that, by how much, once I started digging, was actually out there and energizing and exciting.
Now I'm even more excited and a little deflated because I was waiting for volume 2, but I was hoping it would be from the 60s to the 21st century, but it seems like there have to be 3 volumes. So we're talking about an encyclopedia.
Well, you can look at Emily Hobson's book on the lavender and red, and you can look at Sarah Schulman's new book on Act Up, where you appear, and I think you'll find the subsequent volumes might have been written by others.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that I wanted to talk a little bit about that. You've sort of anticipated a question, or maybe the question is obvious, which is, so when I was researching my own book, I reread Jose Munoz's work on ephemera, and it kind of broke my heart to think that in the 21st century, he still needed to make the case for the existence of a queer archive, where it might reside, how it might be read. And when I was co-curating on the queer waterfront with Hugh Ryan, who's an ingenious scholar and was beating every bush to smithereens, the difficulty of finding this kind of evidence, especially of queer working class footprint, is really tough. So I had all these questions about like how you squared those historiographic holes that are intrinsic to queer documentation with the rigors of academia, while you were doing research on this book, especially the double whammy of like teasing out queerness from existing documentation on the of the left. Was it a process of cross-referencing personal papers with political archives?
I certainly think that there was plenty of cross-referencing that was going on. If I If I read a novel that was particularly fascinating to me, I wanted to know who wrote it. I wanted to know who they were in conversation with. And there were actually, it was surprising to me. This is such a beatific light that's coming in here. I feel like this is just really quite lovely. But there was a lot of there were a lot of folks who actually preserved more than I expected. So there were people who exchanged letters, and I really expected that those kinds of letters would have been destroyed. But there was clearly something going on that made some of these people want to be remembered. And I think that there's something really heartbreaking about how many people probably destroyed a lot of their letters and diaries and things like that to make sure that they weren't remembered, because it's hard enough to not be remembered and to think that you're not going to be remembered, but it has to be even harder to intentionally make sure you're not remembered. So I entered into the space of the archive and into the lives of the people that I was trying to listen to from a distance of time, to really be attentive to not only what they preserved, but any clues as to why they preserved it. And one of the people that I was most fascinated by was a woman named Betty Millard, who was a queer communist. And in her diaries, she actually did a lot to preserve her own stories as a queer woman within the Communist Party. And yet, even within those documents, there were these spaces where it wasn't just a redaction, like you get in an FBI file where somebody takes a Sharpie and crosses out so that you absolutely cannot read through it to see what was written there. She went a step beyond that. She took a scalpel or an X-Acto knife of some kind, and she excised pieces from the page. So she would be starting to talk about something, and it usually seemed like something that was going to get sort of explicitly sexual, and then the page would be cut. And I thought that that was just such a fascinating testament to, she didn't throw the diary away. She didn't, it actually got donated to Smith College, where it's in the archive. She wanted to be remembered somehow. But at the same time, there was this palimpsest of the fear that she lived in and the anxiety that caused her to know exactly, she had to know exactly what it was about her life that would be most dangerous if it was found out. And I wasn't sure if it was sex or radicalism that she was excising, only that she had excised something. So I tried to understand and was really felt a responsibility to understand how those twin pressures might have structured the way that she lived her life, but also the sort of bravery of taking the care to allow those parts that could be remembered to be remembered. And I just think that's a very powerful thing for an historical figure to actually, for her to have thought about that in advance. It's just, it's an act of bravery, it's an act of generosity, and it's an act of beauty.
I think, wow. I think that the question still exists for feminist artists. The collective Fierce Pussy does a lot of work around excised text or restructuring text by removing certain pieces of it. But I think you've hit on something with this anecdote about the removal of the paper, is the difference between erasure and negative mark making. Like when the FBI sends you an excised FOIA, it's black marks. This is the opposite of that. This is a part of a process of selfhood, in a way, that she chose the manner in which her work would be preserved. And I think for those of you who don't know about the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Brooklyn, you should. But I use it all the time and know a lot of people involved with it. And they spend so much time carefully thinking through the questions of which parts of the archive were meant to be seen and which parts weren't, and what the social context that existed around it. And I think again, the double whammy of the left, the subject matter of your book sort of overlaps with, it goes from the egalitarian fantasias of the turn of the 20th century, where everyone thought that the Soviet Union meant we were headed for a different world, to your book is sort of capped at the FBI and the House Un-American Activities Committee. So there's a lot of ground in between. And I think the ways in which queer people were out, chose to be out, and found community is really hidden in that, is bracketed by those two periods. And while I was reading the book, I kept thinking, well, is part of the prevalence of queers in the Communist Party and the left the same instinct that leads queers to move to the city, to find a community or to find themselves or to be themselves? The way you've described it, the left had open arms for that. Is that part, do you think, of what was going on?
I mean, I think the arms were semi-open. I might say, the arms were not necessarily a wide open embrace. But part of what I started to pick up on, especially before the rise of fascism, when anti-fascism shifts the left so dramatically because of this existential threat that requires basically all hands on deck and requires maybe more coalition building. But in the most revolutionary period of the left, I think that for many queer people, they're looking at a state that represses them, and they're looking at a social movement that rejects that state. And so I think that some of the ways that, the figures that I talk about in this book entered into the left was because they just didn't want to be part of the system that existed, and they didn't want to be part of the structures of oppression that were already there. And also, I think a lot of them were really inspired by the anti-racism on the left, that thinking about the left as a space that was doing anti-racist work, that the politics of coalition between people who had experienced multiple forms of oppression was also something that the left was poised and well positioned and already doing the work of bringing into the conversation. So I think there was also one other thing that I'll say, and I don't want to yammer on too long, but one other thing I'll say is that belonging to the left was understood as a form of deviance. It was outside of what was behavior that was sanctioned by the state, that was permissible, that was respectable. It was already deviant to belong to the left. And so for folks that were being cast as deviant because of their sexual desires or practices or behaviors, joining with a movement that was also seen as deviant, I think was actually kind of thrilling for some of them. So it was less a question of whether they were seeing themselves represented within that movement, and more how that movement was being represented as something that was outside of the bourgeois constraints that otherwise made life boring. Should I read the part about Betty Millard here? Because I think as character, I really think it's very boring when you're sitting in a Zoom reading to listen to someone read a book of history. So I didn't want to read too much. But I did sort of want to bring some of the voices of the actual people themselves to the forefront. And Betty Millard's an interesting person who I've mentioned already in terms of her diaries. So that sort of excitement about being part of this social movement that was marked by deviance, I think, is something she can articulate better than me. So maybe I'll take a minute here, if that's okay, Avram.
Sure.
To let Betty Millard speak to us a little bit.
Sure.
All right. On June 28th, 1947, Betty Millard hosted what appears to have been one hell of a party in her West 4th Street apartment. Quote, "The people downstairs are going to be away for the weekend," she wrote in her invitation. "We've got the pedal on the piano tied up again with a hunk of chicken wire, so you can sing and stomp on the floor and all hell can break loose here this Saturday night if that's the mood you're in. A wonderful trombone player we know is coming over with some of his friends, and if you're an aficionado of long hair, we've got that. And if you're a short hair, we've got that too. If you just want to sit under the plane trees and discuss the relationship between the seconds, you can do that in the garden out back. While this rip-roaring queer party promised to be a good time, Millard was not one to pass up a chance to make her event work for the working class. The cost of this is a mere buck, plus a negligible sum if you find yourself thirsty, and the money goes to New Masses. And New Masses, by the way, was a major left-wing magazine. Given that the left has so often been characterized as homophobic, misogynist, and boring, it's interesting to learn of a party promising whatever you're into, alongside dissections of patriarchy and radical fundraising. As Daniel Horowitz has noted in his study of Bohemian Los Angeles, sexual libertines and radical activists often occupied the same spaces. For lesbian leftists in the 1930s and 40s, they often occupied the same bodies as well. Betty Millard was intimately connected to the world of both homosexuality and the left. For her, liberating the working class was not mere theory. She moved between jobs frequently, from checking dresses at Macy's, 6 weeks, to operating a turret lathe at Ford, 9.5 months. She worked as a receptionist 4 weeks and 3 days, and a night blood manager at the Brooklyn Red Cross, 3 weeks, before moving into editorial work at New Masses, 3 years, 9 months, the Los Angeles Review of Books, 5 years, and Henry Holding Company, several months. And I'm going to just skip ahead here, where she actually writes in her diary, I took a long step in the dark toward a dark place from which there's no returning, but I think it was an inevitable conversation which would have happened without the gin, and I think it's been coming for a year, since the 4th of November. Now I'm wondering where my very good friend is and how much she knows and how much the other knows, and especially how much they're now going to find out. Plenty of women found out. Nina's bedroom is getting to be quite an institution in my life, she journaled in 1934. Later, I'm playing a new role these days, and I'm not sure how the part suits me. I'm cast as a corrupter of the morals of the young, and I will have to admit that I enjoy it very much, except for certain scruples of conscience, which are not quite as strong as they should be. Still later, and this is the last part I'll read from her diary. This interesting day in the Millard life began about 10 p.m. and ended about 8:30 a.m. with much novel experience in between, supplying valuable addenda to observations of July 3rd. The locale this time was a place in Long Beach called the Paradise. This dive is inhabited by fags as well as spriggans. I had a long conversation with a sweet little fag that didn't like to do drag acts in Miami because it was too much trouble to change, and who always wanted to be an actress. So what I just wanted, the reason I wanted to read that piece is because I just think that the liveliness of this is so unexpected. The ways in which she was so careful to include her radical politics in her queer world making, having this party where you have long hairs and short hairs and also raising money for New Masses. It just feels like a surprise to me if we think about the left as being this kind of purely doctrinaire space that can only be known through the homophobia of the people at the top of the food chain within the Communist Party, and you ignore the people on the ground and the lives that they were living, the art that they were creating, the novels that they were writing, the magazines that they were publishing. It looks a little different if you take that bottom-up approach, and I think that figures like Betty Millard have a lot to teach us about social movement organizing and the sort of joy that can come out of that.
I love that you read that section, and you're going to scream, but in my notes I had a part of that as something I was going to read if you didn't. So I think now might be a good time to move in this direction, and I know you won't be offended by this observation, but you've just illustrated that Love's Next Meeting sort of lapses into a dishiness from time to time. And I think that the ways in which queers see themselves, is so distinct from the way in which we think about histories and historiography, and it's so not part of common knowledge that Polari, the Cockney slang that some argue go back to the 16th century, but certainly went back to the 19th century, is responsible for almost all of drag slang and a lot of slang that all of us use. So I think that there is this kind of, in the debate about queer identity and whether you could actually say there were queer people or gay people in the 19th century because that identity didn't exist, people knew where the Molly houses were, so they must have known who they were and how they could get laid, right? So I think there's this like hidden from history, but not from queer history, is a level of dishiness. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that the extent to which it exists in Love's Next Meeting is a function of having to read between the lines of the archive, cross-reference it to personal accounts? Is it the nature of the personal nature of queer community building, or the covert nature of sexual dissonance, or just your take on all of history in general?
Well, certainly I've learned a lot from queer historians and queer studies scholars who have come before and people who have written about queer history. So, taking gossip seriously as a form of knowledge production and knowledge capacity building, I think is something that I've learned from other scholars. And I think that, oftentimes that can be seen as something that's a sort of vicious or nefarious part of queer culture. But it's actually something that can also be a form of documentation that we need to take seriously. And I think that that's true on the left as well. The question of who is and who isn't is something that leftists were musing about as well. And there's some great passages that I found in various documents left by Jim Kepner, who was a gay leftist, who was a founder of a homophile movement in the 1950s, where he's sort of dishing about who's a Trotskyist and who's a Stalinist. And the same time, he's dishing about gay people and who is and who isn't. And it sort of folds neatly one into the other. And I think that, the relationship between political sympathies and sexual desire and whatnot are not always as neatly compartmentalizable as they might appear to be on the surface. But I also think that if we want to take queer history seriously, and I think this is true of left history as well, we have to be open to looking outside of archives that are recognized as being, official. We can't only look to the Communist Party to tell the history of the Communist Party. We can't only look at the records of the organization to tell the story about the lives of people who were working within the organization. My book was not written before until like what it was written before Sarah Schulman's incredible history of ACT UP that was just published came out. But I think that Sarah does a great job of thinking about what you do when you have people who are dishing on the same moment from totally competing perspectives, and how you as the author is going to navigate that. And part of what it becomes important is recognizing that there's going to be conflict at the center of any narrative, and that you're never going to be able to tell the whole story. So why should we presume to know? Why should we presume to know which gossip was the accurate gossip? And then if we can't presume to know, then how do we move forward with telling these stories?
Yeah, I think that is the basic dilemma, and it definitely exists. Sarah really, as a dramatist, really put her finger on it by starting with tropes and talking about conflicts and highlighting counter narratives, is very much the nature of the reality on the ground, and a much truer account of ACT UP than many other accounts, except mine, of course, which is very specific. So we're in that turf, and I think we're back to Munoz, like this heartbreaking plea for an expansive idea about what an archive can mean in the case of queer ephemera or queer trace evidence. So since you've opened the door, and I hate it when people quote song lyrics, but while I was reading some of the earlier passages in your book, I kept hearing that Jefferson Airplane line from We Can Be Together. In order to survive, we steal, cheat, lie, forge, fuck, hide, and steal. We are obscene, lawless, hideous, dangerous, dirty, violent, and young, but we should be together. So there's this passage in your book where you talk about how the left got dirty, which it might be good to downshift now that we've put some theoretical basis behind the dishiness. Tell me why you felt like that was a section of the book that was needed.
So in order to try and understand how queer sexuality was part of the left and how queer leftists were thinking about their relationship to the organized left, I sort of felt like I had to go in and think about the left in relation to sexuality more generally. So again, I do think that we have a lot of assumptions about the left in relation to sexuality that often treats it as though it were not a primary concern on the left, that the left was so dedicated to class-based revolution that there was really an almost ascetic quality that was demanded of people to be part of this radical social movement. And that wasn't really the case. And so I found all kinds of instances in newspapers, magazines. Again, like I like literature, so I bring literature to it into it as well, where leftists were actually quite invested in sexual politics and were sort of having fun with it. One of the things that was one of the more funny parts that I found in researching the book was the 1927 Anti-Obscenity Ball that was hosted by New Masses. Well, New Masses was arguably one of the most doctrinaire communist publications, maybe not quite as much as the Daily Worker, but it was very closely associated with the Communist Party. But in 1927, they put on this Anti-Obscenity Ball, which was a sort of satirical ball that was inviting people to show up as like basically dressed as prudes, like dressed as the censors that were attempting to suppress sexual content from being sent in the mail. And so their response wasn't to, you know, immediately like go out in the streets with their picket signs, which there was plenty of time and space for as well. Their impulse wasn't to go and picket the postmaster. Their impulse was to render their understanding of the kind of censorship that they were being subjected to utterly farcical, to sort of make clear how absurd it was. And so there was a sort of playfulness, and obscenity law was something that was used not just to target sex, it was also used to target radical content. So there was this sort of free-for-all as well, I think, among people on the left to say, well, we're going to get censored anyway. And so they were very skilled. People who were publishing leftist periodicals and books and whatnot were very skilled at using the courts to be able to continue to send their materials through the mail. So they were very skilled at that. But I think that they also had an understanding that they were being targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with the actual content. It had to do with the ideology. And so there was no reason to even play the game. And that sort of opened them up to be able to include things around sex and sexuality that other publications that were trying to stay within the confines of the law, who weren't always already targeted, had a little bit more skittishness around. So I was interested in how the left sort of ended up in that position of foregrounding a kind of playful engagement with sexuality. I'm going on and on. Avram, what time were we supposed to turn to Q&A? I don't remember. We're at
Soon, but
7:40.
I have to ask you this to comment on the Upton Sinclair Sergei Eisenstein section. You know, after everything that you've just said about the new masses and the playfulness of the left, that section left me speechless. Can you talk about that? I wasn't aware of any of that. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, Upton Sinclair, he was sort of proud of his, I'm in Provincetown right now, and Upton Sinclair's good friend, Mary Heaton Vorst, lived just up the road from me. And so I don't know how to puzzle through the fact that he was associating with all these like radical, you know, people who had progressive sexual politics. And yet he himself was so sort of pleased to position himself as, what was the phrase, the prized prude of the socialist movement. And so, you know, Upton Sinclair was maybe not quite on the vanguard of doing that work of making sexual radicalism inextricable from his socialist leanings, or not even leanings, his socialism more generally. So I think that, you know, I don't want to ascribe it to a generational thing, but I do think that, you know, not to be too, I don't think this was always the case, but I think the further left you went, the more the sort of respectability politics got left behind. And Sinclair was sort of more on the socialist side than the communist side. So there was still some kind of space for a respectable socialist politics, not always and not everywhere, but that might have informed it too. But yeah, his trip to Mexico with Eisenstein, was not a proud moment when he essentially complained about the homosexuality and the sort of, I can't remember the exact language, but the cavorting, the sex, the same-sex intimacy, the pornography. You know, he really made a mess of things, and sort of prevented that movie from even getting made in any meaningful way, because he sort of stepped in and took a hard stand against it. He wasn't the most sympathetic to the queer left that I'm trying to document.
Yeah, no, he's the antithesis, and that's why I felt like I wanted to throw him in the mix. And while I was reading it, I was thinking, in the way that you've mapped out the way queers sort of shift in through social movements for survival. In the Soviet Union, they do that as well. So here you have a double layer of that when you're talking about Eisenstein. Anyway, did we want to do a Q&A? We have 15 minutes. Or was there something else you wanted to say? I have lots to say, but was there something?
Let's give it a shot in case anybody wants to jump in, because I know you and I could go on for several more hours.
Okay.
Sure. And I'll leave room for closing thoughts and anything else you two want to sort of introduce before we close. But so we have a couple questions. I also just want to take a moment to recognize the historians or you know, people involved in the audience who wrote in all these comments, especially Bettina, who wants us to know that we've been saying Betty's name wrong. I guess it's Betty Millard, if I'm understanding Bettina's note correctly, but I just wanted to recognize that. And then I'm going to jump into this question from an attendee who asks, regarding the FBI files you were able to unearth, could you talk a bit about the details that came up? Were there radicals whose daily life was more heavily surveyed than others?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the question here. The FBI files, which the three of us were actually talking about in the waiting room before this began, there were a lot of FBI files that, despite my FOIA request coming in years and years ago, I never got access to. But there's something particularly heartbreaking about any of the FBI files that I found. So, for example, Edward Melkarth, whose painting is on the cover of the book and who is the figure that I opened the book with, who was himself a gay communist, his letters in the 1950s were oftentimes filled with what might have been understood as paranoid rantings about being followed by the FBI, having his passport taken away from him at airports. And he was absolutely paranoid. And his FBI file reveals that all of his paranoia was in response to things that were actually happening. So there's something kind of heartbreaking about realizing that we now have the vantage point of hindsight to be able to see that some of the things that the individuals that I was looking at, that they were absolutely convinced that they were losing their minds when in fact they were perceptive to precisely the world that they were living in. And, you know, so that can be a little heartbreaking to bear witness to. So some of the folks that I write about, Willard Motley, for example, who was a Black leftist writer in the mid 20th century, he was followed for decades, and he ended up leaving the U.S. He moved to Mexico and died sort of destitute in the 1960s, in part because of the challenges that he faced due to both his politics and his sexuality. You know, these were intense pressures. David McKelvey White was fired from 2 jobs because of his joining up with the Spanish Civil War, and in fact, someone outed him at a college that he taught at. I actually got his FBI file and I actually emailed the college and said, what are you going to do about this legacy? Because there was an informant, his department chair informed on him, and that was in the FBI file. So, you know, a lot of the folks who were in here who were most fearful about what the surveillance state was doing were absolutely correct, and their lives were really shattered by that. And so Betty Millard, excising passages from her journal with that X-Acto knife, were not acting out of an abundance of caution. They were acting out of an attentiveness to all the different social pressures that were coming to bear upon them. So yeah, I mean, I wish I could get more of the FBI files, but my FOIA requests for many of them remain unanswered. So I didn't have access to as many of those as I had hoped.
And on the subject of Betty, as well as I think just what we've sort of been talking about tonight. So we have a question from Gregory in the audience who asks, Aaron, your subtitle describes this as a forgotten history, but you referred tonight to people working to excise some of this evidence and documentation to actively shape what they left for history. So I'm just wondering about that contrast between the sort of passive process invoked by forgetting versus the more active work of protecting or hiding.
That's a wonderful question. And one of the things that I want to mention here is that I think that it's probably likely that readers are going to assume that the forgotten piece is historians forgetting. But I actually think that it was a more strategic kind of forgetting that happened under McCarthyism. So one of the most fascinating things that I noticed doing the research for this book was that during the McCarthy era, as the gay rights movement, which was called the homophile movement at the time that it appeared in the 1950s, as the homophile movement was organizing, those who sought to discredit the old left at that moment oftentimes did that by associating it with homosexuality and with gay people. And the response within the gay rights movement was oftentimes to strategically refuse to allow that history to be remembered. So in this weird way, the history of homosexuality in the left in earlier decades before the 1950s was being forgotten as a strategy in order to disavow a past that might be inconvenient under an incredibly repressive moment. So the forgetting wasn't benign. I don't even think it was passive. I think that there was a very strategic use of the possibility of forgetting lives that are easily forgotten. that became something of a strategy for moving away from that past, pretending that that past didn't exist, pretending that that history, which might have been inconvenient at a moment of tremendous anxiety around radical politics, that kind of forgetting became something that was an incredibly powerful force and a sort of divergent path. You could try and forget that past and just align yourself with good citizenship, with respectability politics, with a sort of assimilationist idea of what sexuality could look like to achieve goals. And then in the process of doing that kind of forgetting, what do you have to forget about? You have to forget about the centrality of anti-racism to any radical organizing. You have to forget about people being evicted and losing their homes under predatory capitalism. You have to forget about unemployment happening to, to people who are working in jobs that already push them to the margins. You have to forget about poverty. You have to forget about so much. And so the forgetting in the title, I think, probably comes across as more passive than I intended to. And I'm not actually targeting historians for not writing about this stuff in the past, but I am sort of trying to suggest how it's been very strategically useful to disavow that past. And so the process of remembering can be a way to, I hope, not let that happen again.
So this next question feels sort of like the flip of the question I just asked, but you described earlier in the evening something, you used the word beautiful to describe Betty Millard's diary, which I thought was so interesting because a lot of what we're talking about is hiding, but also you still are accentuating parts of yourself, at various moments. But so this question from this attendee: the tension between disclosure and withholding, often, at least for this queer person, feels not only foundational to being queer, but often feels essential to the kind of art we make and continue to make. Camp is so much about accentuation as a form of concealment. Can you talk a little bit more about the self-excision of Betty Millard's diary, and if you think choosing to hide oneself can be a form of radicalism?
That is, wow, these are great questions. Wow. So I think that we oftentimes, I keep using the word we, which is such an obnoxious way to assume that everybody thinks the same thing when it's probably just my own lazy thinking. But I think that there can be a tendency to think that visibility as a form of politics is always working towards liberation. And I think that that becomes especially true when we're talking about queer politics, because the powerful force of being made invisible has left so many historical scars, both on subjects and on communities. And so I think that that the response to that is often in political settings to focus on visibility, and to focus on visibility as something that will lead towards liberation. But in fact, I don't think that that's always true. I think that visibility works best for those who are already in a position of strength, and for those who are laboring at the margins of society. Visibility doesn't get you very far. And so I think that for someone who is not doing their work in a public way and saying, I am advocating for gay people from a left-wing Marxist perspective right here in 1936, because it doesn't have that veneer of visibility that's become so central to queer politics later, I think that that can oftentimes feel like an insufficient politics. And I don't think that's quite fair, because I think that the people who were fighting for a better world were fighting for a better world that wasn't just about becoming visible, but was more about creating coalitions and alliances with other people who were oppressed. And the way that you do that is by moving through the same spaces as people who experience various forms of oppression. Sometimes that isn't something that has to happen in public. Sometimes that can be something that happens quietly. And if we only want to listen to the voices of those who are able to get on Fox News to put forward a perspective and think that they're going to get somewhere by convincing Tucker Carlson that he's suddenly going to wake up and change his mind, that's going to leave a lot of people behind. And a lot of people who have important roles to play within broader social movements aren't those who have access to the mechanisms through which they can become visible. So in trying to think seriously about diaries and private correspondence as sources that were important integral pieces of social movement building, I really wanted to try and advocate for the folks toiling away, attending these meetings with one another, or in basements or in spaces where they were in cells where they literally didn't even know who else was in the same organization because there was such a protective mechanism in place to prevent them from being known. That those voices and those lives and those people and those ways of understanding political commitments could also point towards liberation and also paved the way for coalition building and social movement building that moves beyond simply the question of who's visible and who's invisible. And I could say a lot more on that, but I think that that's probably more than the person who asked the question even bargained for.
Exceptional answers. Thank you so very much. I think we have time for one more quick question. So I'm just going to turn to our friend Bettina again, who I think you might have brought this up in either the book or the discussion, but she is asking if you could say more about John Pitman's article on repression of Negroes and homosexuals from 1932, and if that came up in the book at all.
Yeah, so John Pitman was a Black leftist journalist who edited a newspaper called The Spokesman out of San Francisco in the 1930s, and eventually became an editor on People's World, which was a leftist newspaper. And in 1932, he wrote an editorial called Prejudice Against Homosexuals that ran in the San Francisco Spokesman, again, a Black radical newspaper, not a gay and lesbian newspaper. And that article was responding to a gathering of some folks at a drag masquerade, essentially, and the sort of public outcry against them. And Pitman wrote this editorial, and Pitman was like a hard left Marxist, and he endorsed communist candidates and whatnot. This was a hard left Black radical newspaper. And he wrote this article in 1932. It was titled Prejudice Against Homosexuals. It was incredibly outspoken and connected resistance to race prejudice to connect to prejudice against homosexuals, and made this unbelievably nuanced argument that was opposing prejudice against homosexuals in this very leftist space as somebody who was invested in Black radical politics. And I won't go into too much detail because we don't have the time for that here. I do talk about that piece in this book. But what I will say is, why doesn't our understanding of queer history start there? Why is that not the first piece that we learn when we talk about the gay and lesbian and the queer past in the United States? Why is that not being assigned in high schools? Why doesn't that come before Stonewall? We all know that there were riots that happened before Stonewall, but do we know that there was radical queer politics? What if we started there? What if the place where we looked for a queer past wasn't in the new left gay liberation movement, as important as that is, and as much as I don't want to diminish the significance of that, but what if we started with Pitman? What if we started with Black radicalism in San Francisco and the way that that created an opportunity to think about queer history in a far more nuanced way than anything that came out of the homophile movement in the 1950s? What would our legacy look like? What would that mean for queer people of color today who are organizing within Black Lives Matter or whatever, and really don't necessarily see themselves when they look at the Mattachine Review? I think that that's an incredibly important piece, and I appreciate Bettina, who's also doing incredible work, by the way, on the queer left, and with whom I've been in conversation for years. it's an incredible document that exists and that hasn't been foregrounded and centralized enough. And I think that we should foreground and centralize that article and those stories and the environment that gave rise to that. And I'm not going to say, I was going to say I'll say one other thing, but I'm not. I'm gonna let you go out to enjoy some food or something or whatever you're doing after this, Benjamin.
All right. Well, I did promise to leave some time for you and Avram to have any final thoughts. Avram, were you jumping up to say something?
All I wanted to say was, as usual, Aaron, you've filled me with ideas, and everyone needs to read this book.
Truly, truly, this was such an amazing conversation. So thank you both for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your exceptional questions and all of you for spending part of your evening with us. I'm going to direct you to the chat where I've put the link to purchase tonight's book a couple times. So purchase Love's Next Meeting at harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again to our speakers. All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.